What is going on, guys? Jesse here. So when they came out, the Pixel 6 and Pixel 6 Pro were probably some of the most hype releases to come out last year, mainly because these were the first Pixel devices to be made by Google from the bottom up. Now, Google has made phones in the past, but they always relied on other manufacturers for the design and production of the units. But this time, the phone is fully designed by Google, even including the chip powering it all, which Google is calling Tensor. And of course, everyone's expectations were through the roof because, well, it's Google, one of the biggest tech powerhouses on the planet. But it's been a couple of months now, the hype has died down a little bit, and I think it's a good idea for us to take another look at this and see how well it's held up in the real world for a more significant amount of time than I had for my previous review. So if that sounds good, let's hop right into it. So starting off with the physical design of the phone, I still quite like it. The whole camera visor thing was super controversial, but personally, I'm a pretty big fan. Also, this won't matter to most people because you're probably just going to put a case over it anyways, but I especially like the color choices that are available. When they sent this over, they didn't really give me a choice of which one I wanted, but I'm really glad it was this one. The sort of pastel yellow is a really cool and unique look in my opinion. And I especially like how the top and bottom sections are slightly different shades. I wasn't as big of a fan of these side rails though, like the finish on them is sort of shiny but also brushed at the same time, and it just kind of looks like it used to be shiny but then got dirty or something. Also, this antenna at the top just feels super disruptive to me, and I think they could have just done that a lot better. But overall, design-wise, I'm still a pretty big fan, especially nowadays when it feels like phones are starting to look more and more similar to each other. This really feels like it's got its own identity. Now, build quality-wise, I think they've got a lot to work on, so I wouldn't say this is poorly built, and I think if I wasn't the type of person who had access to a bunch of other flagship devices all the time, I wouldn't really think that much of it. But I mean, if you're trying to make a purchase decision and you're really comparing it to all the other stuff that's out there right now, you definitely will notice a difference. And just to be clear, I'm not worried about durability or anything like that because it's using all the materials that you would expect from a flagship, like Gorilla Glass Victus on the front and back and aluminum side rails. But it's just little stuff here and there that seems kind of off. Like how the gap between the glass and the camera module is a little bit bigger than I think it should be. The buttons, even though they're made out of metal, are very clunky and unsatisfying to press, and how there's this weird seam on either side of the camera visor that really messes up the look for me. But you know, I think for most people that's not really going to be a huge deal because again, you're just going to throw a case on here anyways. But if you like using your phone without a case like I do, then the build quality actually does make somewhat of a difference in the experience of using this. And for me, the design and build are a big factor in my enjoyment of a product like this because, I mean, think about it. Every time you use your phone, you're going to be holding it. Okay, yeah, I know, super obvious, but you get my point. Also pretty obvious, another thing you interact with every time you use the phone is the screen. So let's talk about that next. And honestly, I'm pretty satisfied with it. This has got a 6.7-inch 3120 by 1440p LTPO AMOLED panel with a maximum refresh rate of 120 Hz. So I just threw a bunch of numbers at you guys, but all you really need to know is that it's good. I recently did a comparison between the Pixel S21 Ultra and the iPhone 13 Pro Max, and you should go watch that video, but in the display portion, the Pixel actually came out last, but only by a hair. And honestly, that's nothing to be ashamed of either. It's like getting bronze in the Olympics. Like, yeah, it's the lowest ranking medal, but at the same time, you're the third best in the world. So, hope that made sense. But yeah, anyways, 120 Hz makes everything look super smooth. Colors, contrast, and sharpness all look great, and brightness, even though it isn't quite as good as those other phones I just mentioned, works just fine for pretty much any real-world situation. The bezels are a little bit thicker than I would like, and I'm not a huge fan of the curved edges because it causes some accidental touches here and there, but other than that, this is a really solid screen, which makes looking at pictures, watching videos, and playing games a really good experience. And along with that, the speaker quality on here is pretty good as well. They definitely still sound like phone speakers and you won't be replacing your Bluetooth speakers anytime soon, but they do get a surprising amount of low end in there and get as loud as I would expect from a phone speaker. Still definitely not the best speaker I've heard in a phone though, that still goes to the iPhone. Also, going back to the screen, because it's an OLED, you get the always on display, which is really nice and a feature I really miss ever since going over to the iPhone. Like just being able to glance over at your phone without having to touch or pick it up to see which apps you have notifications from is just such a nice quality of life feature. It does eat into battery life a little bit though, but that's a sacrifice I'm willing to make. And while we're talking about battery life, that's an area that's been disappointing for me with this phone. When I posted my last video of this, a lot of you guys in the comments were saying how you were getting 7-8 hours of screen on time with this, and all I'm gonna say is that that was not my experience at all. So I mean, if you are able to see those kind of battery life numbers, good for you, but in my experience, the battery life has been really rough. And comparing it to all those other phones that are in this price point and you'd realistically be cross-shopping this with, the battery life is just far worse than the competition at the end of the day. So another pain point for me has been with the fingerprint sensor. So it's an under-display optical fingerprint sensor, and in terms of accuracy, meaning how many failed attempts I have trying to unlock this phone, it's actually pretty good. Like I would say that 95% of the time it only takes one try. And it even seems to work with wet fingers, which is awesome. The issue I have though is with the speed. Sometimes it can take up to like a full second to register your fingerprint, which doesn't sound like all that long, but it's long enough that you can really feel the pause and it just breaks the flow of whatever you're doing. Again, this is one of those things where if you're only using this phone and this phone alone, probably something you'll get used to. But if I'm doing my job as the reviewer, I feel like I'm doing a disservice to you guys not to let you know that other phones are better in this area. As far as actually using the phone though, generally my experience has been pretty good. So this is running Android 12 with a new Material U design language that I am a huge fan of. Like aesthetically, I just find it to be very satisfying to look at and use. I just love the super flat design language and how it can pick out the color palette of whatever background you're using and then apply those colors to some of the app icons, widgets, and even inside some of the stock apps, which is awesome. And especially if you choose a background that matches the color of the phone, the whole experience feels very cohesive in a way that other phones just don't really match right now. Also, all the subtle little animations around the UI are really satisfying as well. Like when you turn the phone on and off, you can see the little ripple coming out from where the button is, or how when you get to the end of a menu or a list or something like that, there's a subtle little stretch. I know stuff like that doesn't really matter, but it's subtle touches that companies add like that can really make using a phone more fun. One little annoying thing about Android 12 though is how the brightness slider is 2 swipes away. Like you do 1 swipe down to get the notification tray and then 1 more to get the brightness slider, which to me seems a little bit obnoxious, especially considering that the adaptive brightness on this phone is weirdly bad. Like a lot of the time it just does not know how bright to be, meaning that you have to manually adjust it on the regular. Also, last thing I want to address about the software experience though is bugs. So Pixels have been pretty notorious in the past for getting pretty buggy after prolonged use, and that was especially worrisome this year because this is the first year that Google is making its own silicon and hardware as well as the software. But personally, I haven't really experienced anything that I think is really worth mentioning. Like I might have dropped a couple of frames here and there, but I don't think I've ever used a phone where that didn't happen. However, I definitely did want to mention it this time because from what I've seen and heard around the internet, a lot of people are having issues with their Pixel devices. And normally I wouldn't include this just because it's not been my experience, but this seems to be widespread and well documented enough that it should be something for you to consider. Anyways, on that note, like I mentioned earlier, this has got Google's first generation of Tensor, which Google claims enables a lot of features that would otherwise be impossible, like real-time language translation with the processing done all locally. Like before this feature was available, but you had to be connected to Google servers where all the processing was actually being done. Now you can even do it when you're not connected to the internet. And it is really quite impressive. But out of all the features they're marketing for the phone, the only one that I found I consistently used was the speech to text function. So pretty much every modern phone does have speech to text nowadays, but the way that the Pixel handles it is just on another level. Like it really feels like you don't have to wait for the phone, like you just speak normally and it will keep up in real time. And I've compared it to other devices, but the speed and accuracy on the Pixel is just by far and away the best. And it's to the point that I find myself actually changing the way that I use my phone to incorporate using speech to text more often. Like ever since getting this phone, I've been writing the majority of my scripts for these YouTube videos through speech to text, which have just made my life way easier. Okay, and last but not least, let's talk about the reason that most people get a Pixel in the first place, the cameras. So hardware-wise, we've got a triple camera system on the back with a 50 megapixel f1.9 wide, 12 megapixel f2.2 ultra wide, and a 48 megapixel f3.5 4x periscope telephoto zoom lens. And on the front, we've got an 11.1 megapixel ultra wide selfie camera, which I think is sick and every phone should have. Great for fitting in those socially distant selfies. And overall, I would say that the camera system on this phone is great for photos, and I don't think anyone would be disappointed in the performance in that area. but also at the same time, it can be a little bit inconsistent at times. And the video quality is also still nothing to write home about. But before we talk about the quality, one thing I really like about the camera app and just using the camera are these sliders that you get for temperature and exposure. Some other phones also let you do something sort of similar, but they really don't have it as readily available as this, and I really like to see that level of control. As far as the actual quality goes though, generally it seems to be pretty good, and I'll throw some shots up on the screen so you can see for yourself. HDR processing is on point, and we've got that signature contrasty look that Pixels are known for, and I think most people will find to be very agreeable. Although I did notice that it does tend to lean towards always balancing a little bit on the cooler side, especially when there's not that much light, and it can sometimes make colors look a little strange. But like I said, overall, I'm pretty satisfied. The selfie camera also seems to be pretty good. I don't personally get a ton of use out of it, but like I said earlier, the ultra-wide capability is really nice. One of the weird things though is that when you're using the selfie camera, the viewfinder will become excessively noisy whenever anything in the frame is moving. And it just kind of looks like the processor is trying to do all the denoising and that kind of thing, but it can only do like a couple of frames at a time. The actual product that comes out of the selfie camera will look fine, just while you're using it, it's gonna look pretty rough, which makes the experience of using it a little worse, but it's not the biggest deal. Video quality is fine, like it gets the job done, but I wouldn't get this expressly for the video quality. Anyways, that's been my experience with the Pixel 6 Pro after using it on and off for the past 3 months, and I gotta say that it's still a pretty solid phone, just with a few caveats. Mainly battery life and reliability over longer periods of time. And I think if you're trying to make a purchase decision right now as to which phone you want to get right now, you're gonna have to weigh how much you care about those things to see if this is gonna be worth it to you. And for me personally, assuming that I continue not to experience excessive bugs in the software, I would be happy to use this as a daily driver. Anyways, those are my thoughts. Let me know what you think in the comment section down below. Remember to smash that like button, and if you enjoy content like this, think about subscribing and hitting the bell so you don't miss anything. As always, thank you so much for watching, and I'll catch you guys in the next one. Peace!